The year was 1884, when a crowd gathered outside a freak show tent in London, unaware they were about to witness something that would haunt their nightmares forever. Inside that tent stood Joseph Merrick, a man so grotesquely deformed that women fainted at the sight of him, children screamed in terror, and grown men turned away in disgust. His skull had grown to 3 times its normal size. His skin hung in thick, cauliflower-like masses, and his right arm had swollen to such monstrous proportions that it no longer resembled anything human. But the true horror wasn't what people could see. It was the whispered question that followed him everywhere. What ungodly act had created this living nightmare? Was Joseph Merrick the cursed product of a forbidden bloodline? A punishment for sins committed behind closed doors? The answer would prove far more terrifying than anyone could imagine, because the real monster wasn't Joseph Merrick at all. Hello everyone, where are you from? If you're fascinated by the darkest medical mysteries that America and the world have tried to hide, then you're in the right place. Hit that like button right now, and subscribe to Cursed America. Because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about the Elephant Man. Turn on notifications because we're diving deep into stories that will disturb your sleep and question everything you believe about human nature. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare truly began. Leicester, England, 1862. Joseph Carey Merrick entered this world as a normal, beautiful baby boy. His mother Mary Jane held him close, counting his perfect little fingers and toes, never imagining the horror that was already beginning its slow transformation inside his tiny body. For the first few years, Joseph was an ordinary child, playing in the streets, laughing with other children, living a life of innocent normalcy. But by the age of 5, something changed, something dark and irreversible. It started with his lips. They began to swell, slowly at first, then with alarming speed. His mother noticed it one morning when he came down for breakfast, his upper lip protruding slightly more than it had the day before. She touched his face gently, worry creeping into her eyes, but she told herself it was just temporary swelling, perhaps from a minor injury. But it wasn't temporary. Within months, his lips had enlarged to grotesque proportions, making it difficult for him to speak clearly. Then his forehead began to grow, the bone pushing outward in irregular lumps and bumps, creating a landscape of deformity across what had once been a handsome young face. The neighborhood children, who had once been his friends, now crossed the street to avoid him. They called him monster, devil child, and other names too cruel to repeat. Joseph's mother, despite her own deteriorating health, tried desperately to protect him, to shield him from the cruelty of the world. She would hold him at night when he cried, when he asked her why God had cursed him, why he had to look like this. She had no answers, only tears that fell silently onto his deformed head. By the age of 11, Joseph's right arm had begun its own transformation into something nightmarish. The skin thickened, became rough and papillomatous, hanging in folds like elephant hide. His hand swelled until his fingers could barely move, becoming a useless appendage that hung heavily at his side. His legs began to show similar changes, making walking increasingly painful and difficult. But the cruelest transformation was happening to his skull. The bones continued to grow, creating massive protrusions that pushed his right eye downward and nearly closed it completely. The back of his head grew so large and heavy that he could no longer lie down to sleep. For the rest of his life, Joseph Merrick would sleep sitting up, his enormous head resting on his knees, never knowing the simple comfort of laying his head on a pillow. Then came the blow that would shatter what remained of Joseph's childhood. When he was 13 years old, his mother died. Mary Jane Merrick, the one person who had loved him unconditionally, who had seen past his monstrous exterior to the gentle soul within, was gone. Joseph was left in the care of his father, who quickly remarried a woman who looked upon Joseph with unconcealed disgust. His stepmother made no effort to hide her revulsion. She refused to eat at the same table with him, refused to touch anything he had touched, and eventually convinced Joseph's father that the boy needed to leave their home. At just 13 years old, Joseph Merrick was thrown out onto the streets to survive on his own. Can you imagine that? A child, already dealing with a body that was betraying him in the most horrific ways possible, now abandoned by his own family, left to face a world that saw him as less than human. He tried to work, tried to find honest employment, but who would hire someone whose very appearance sent customers running in terror? He attempted to sell goods door to door, but doors slammed in his face before he could even speak. Women screamed, men threatened him, and children threw stones. Desperate and starving, Joseph had only one option left. He would have to become what society had already decided he was. He would have to become a freak, a curiosity, a monster for people to gawk at. In 1884, he entered into an agreement with a showman named Tom Norman to be exhibited in a freak show. The handbills advertising his appearance were designed to maximize shock and horror. The Elephant Man, half elephant, the most degraded of all human beings. For a few coins, people could enter the tent and stare at Joseph, could point and gasp and thank God that they weren't cursed like he was. Tom Norman would later insist that he treated Joseph with dignity and respect, that he saw their relationship as a business arrangement between equals. But the truth is far more complex and disturbing. Joseph stood on a platform while crowds of people examined him like a circus animal. He was poked, prodded, and forced to display his deformities from every angle. The degradation was absolute, and yet this was still better than starving in the streets. At least here, he earned enough money to survive, to eat, to have a roof over his head, even if that roof was a freak show tent. But then everything changed when a young surgeon named Frederick Treves attended the show. Treves was fascinated not by Joseph as a spectacle, but as a medical mystery. He paid for a private examination, and what he discovered both horrified and intrigued him. Joseph's body was covered in bony masses and skin overgrowth. The circumference of his head measured 36 inches, his right wrist 12 inches, his right hand 12 inches across. His spine was curved, his hips damaged, his legs deformed. But when Treves looked into Joseph's eyes, he saw something that everyone else had missed: intelligence, sensitivity, and a desperate desire to be seen as human. Treves arranged for Joseph to be examined at the London Hospital Medical School, where doctors studied him, measured him, photographed him, and debated what could have caused such extreme deformations. And this is where the darkest rumors began to spread, whispers that would follow Joseph even beyond his grave. Some doctors, influenced by the Victorian obsession with heredity and the growing eugenics movement, began to suggest that Joseph's condition must be the result of inbreeding, of some forbidden union between close blood relatives. The theory was simple and damning. Such extreme deformity could only result from corrupted bloodlines, from families who had violated natural law. The rumor spread like wildfire through London's medical community and beyond. Newspaper articles hinted at dark family secrets. People whispered that Joseph's parents must have been siblings, or perhaps a father and daughter, uncle and niece. The speculation became increasingly grotesque and specific, each telling more lurid than the last. Joseph, who could read and was well aware of what was being said about him, was devastated. It wasn't enough that his body had betrayed him. Now his very existence was being used as evidence of moral corruption, of sin, of ancestral evil. But here's the truth that makes this story even more tragic. Joseph Merrick was not the product of inbreeding. His mother and father were not related by blood. There was no forbidden romance, no dark family secret. The real cause of Joseph's condition was something far more random, far more cruel, and far more terrifying, because it meant that what happened to him could happen to anyone. Modern medical analysis of photographs and contemporary medical descriptions has led researchers to conclude that Joseph Merrick most likely suffered from a combination of two extremely rare conditions: Proteus Syndrome and Neurofibromatosis type 1. Proteus Syndrome is a condition so rare that only a few hundred cases have ever been documented in medical history. It's caused by a genetic mutation that occurs randomly during fetal development, a cosmic roll of the dice that results in overgrowth of bones, skin, and other tissues. The mutation is not inherited from parents. It cannot be predicted or prevented, and it manifests differently in every case. Some people with Proteus syndrome have relatively mild symptoms, slight overgrowth in one limb or area of the body. Others, like Joseph Merrick, experience catastrophic, progressive deformity that transforms their entire body into something almost unrecognizable as human. The neurofibromatosis would have added another layer of horror to Joseph's condition, causing tumors to grow along his nerves, creating the massive skin folds and lumps that covered much of his body. Together, these two conditions created a perfect storm of deformity, a medical nightmare that 19th century doctors had no way to understand, prevent, or treat. But admitting ignorance, admitting that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all, was too frightening for Victorian society. It was easier, more comforting somehow, to believe that Joseph's condition was the result of sin, of moral failure, of inbreeding. That way, they could reassure themselves that as long as they lived virtuous lives, as long as they avoided forbidden relationships, they and their children would be safe from such a fate. After his exhibition at the medical school, Joseph returned to the freak show circuit, but public opinion was turning against such displays. The police began shutting down freak shows across London, deeming them offensive and exploitative. Joseph, once again, found himself with nowhere to go and no way to earn money. In a desperate attempt to survive, he took his savings and traveled to Belgium, hoping to continue his exhibition career there. But he was robbed by the man who was supposed to be his manager, left penniless in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language, and where his appearance made him a target for further abuse. Somehow, Joseph managed to make his way back to London. He arrived at Liverpool Street Station in a state of utter desperation, starving, exhausted, and terrified. The crowd that gathered around him was hostile, threatening to turn violent. In a moment of inspiration or desperation, Joseph pulled out a card that Frederick Treves had given him months earlier. The police contacted Treves, who immediately came to rescue Joseph and brought him to the London hospital. Treves arranged for Joseph to live permanently at the hospital, in a set of rooms specially adapted for his needs. For the first time in his adult life, Joseph Merrick had a home, a place where he was safe, where people treated him with kindness and respect. He was visited by members of London's high society, including Alexandra, Princess of Wales, who treated him with genuine warmth and dignity. He began to create beautiful models of buildings and churches out of cardboard, demonstrating an artistic skill and patience that amazed everyone who saw his work. He read voraciously, particularly romance novels and poetry, dreaming of a life he could never have, of love and normalcy and simple human connection. But even in this sanctuary, Joseph Merrick could not escape the prison of his own body. His head continued to grow, becoming heavier and more unwieldy. The strain on his neck was enormous, and doctors knew that eventually the weight would become too much. Joseph knew it too. He would sometimes express a simple, heartbreaking wish: to sleep lying down like normal people, to rest his head on a pillow just once. But everyone, including Joseph, knew that if he tried to sleep lying down, the weight of his massive skull would crush his windpipe and kill him. On April 11, 1890, Joseph Merrick decided he wanted to know what it felt like to sleep like other people. He carefully arranged his pillows, lay down in bed, and closed his eyes. When they found him the next morning, he was dead. His neck had dislocated, his windpipe had been compressed, and he had suffocated. He was just 27 years old. Some say it was an accident, that he simply fell asleep in the wrong position. Others believe it was a deliberate choice, that Joseph Merrick finally decided to experience one normal thing, even if it cost him his life. Frederick Treves was devastated by Joseph's death. He wrote movingly about the gentle, intelligent, sensitive man he had known, trying desperately to counteract the image of Joseph as a monster or a freak. He described Joseph's kindness, his gratitude for small mercies, his romantic nature, and his desperate desire to be seen as human. But even Treves, who genuinely cared for Joseph, perpetuated some of the myths about his condition. In his writings, Treves repeated the story that Joseph's mother had been frightened by an elephant during her pregnancy, and that this shock had somehow caused Joseph's deformities, a theory that had no medical basis whatsoever, but was widely believed in Victorian times. After Joseph's death, his skeleton was preserved and placed in the Medical Museum at the Royal London Hospital, where it remains to this day. His soft tissues were also preserved for a time, though they were eventually destroyed. For more than a century, medical students and researchers have studied Joseph Merrick's remains, trying to understand exactly what combination of conditions created such extreme deformity. DNA analysis has been attempted, but has yielded inconclusive results due to the degradation of the genetic material over time. But here's what makes Joseph Merrick's story even more disturbing when you really think about it. The inbreeding rumors, the speculation about moral corruption and ancestral sin, wasn't just Victorian ignorance. It was a deliberate attempt to create distance, to construct a narrative that meant Joseph's fate could never happen to good, virtuous, normal people. If his condition was the result of inbreeding, then as long as you married outside your family, your children would be safe. If it was punishment for sin, then living a righteous life would protect you. But the truth, the real horror, is that Joseph Merrick was just cosmically unlucky. A random genetic mutation during his development created a cascade of biological failures that transformed him into someone the world saw as a monster. That could happen to anyone. Your child, conceived in love by two healthy, unrelated parents with no family history of genetic disease, could be struck by that same random lightning bolt of genetic mutation. There's no morality test that shields you, no virtue that protects you, no bloodline pure enough to guarantee safety. Joseph Merrick's real curse wasn't that he was born to sinful parents or from an inbred family. His curse was being born at all, being forced to live in a body that turned him into a spectacle, being treated as less than human because of conditions he had no control over. And perhaps the most disturbing thing of all is that even now, more than a century after his death, we're still fascinated by Joseph Merrick's story, still drawn to images of his deformity, still using his tragedy as entertainment. This video you're watching right now, the title that brought you here, the thumbnail that caught your eye, they're all part of that same tradition of exploitation that Joseph endured his entire life. The freak show never really ended, it just moved online. We tell ourselves it's different now, that we're interested in the medical mystery, that we're honoring his memory, but are we really? Or are we just the same crowd that paid their coins to gawk at the Elephant Man? Except now, we click instead of paying admission. The real horror of Joseph Merrick's story isn't the inbreeding rumors, or even the extreme deformity. It's the way society treated him, the way they reduced an intelligent, sensitive human being to a curiosity, a monster, a thing to be exhibited and studied but never truly seen as a person. It's the way his own family abandoned him, the way people crossed the street to avoid him, the way children threw stones and adults looked away in disgust. It's the way that even the people who tried to help him, like Frederick Treves, could never quite see him as fully human, could never quite escape the impulse to examine and categorize and explain, rather than simply to know him as a friend. Joseph Merrick spent his entire adult life trying to prove he was human, trying to show the world that beneath the monstrous exterior was a gentle soul who wanted nothing more than to be treated with basic dignity and kindness. He created beautiful art. He read constantly. He engaged in conversation with anyone who would talk to him as an equal. He endured examinations and exhibitions with grace and patience. He never became bitter or cruel despite having every reason to hate the world that had treated him so terribly. And in the end, he died trying to do something simple and ordinary, something the rest of us take for granted, sleeping with his head on a pillow. The Victorian doctors who examined Joseph Merrick were so convinced there must be some moral explanation for his condition, some way to assign blame and meaning to his suffering, that they invented the inbreeding narrative rather than accept the terrifying randomness of his fate. Even today, when we know better, when we understand Proteus Syndrome and random genetic mutations, we still struggle with the implications. We want to believe that terrible things happen for reasons, that suffering has meaning, that there's some cosmic justice, or at least logic to who gets struck by genetic lightning and who doesn't. But Joseph Merrick's story teaches us something darker and more honest. Sometimes terrible things happen to innocent people for no reason at all. Sometimes a child is born with a condition that will transform them into someone the world sees as a monster. And there's no one to blame, no sin to point to, no prevention or cure. The universe is indifferent to human suffering, and genetic mutations don't care about virtue or vice, about good families or bad ones, about who deserves their fate and who doesn't. That's the real horror behind the elephant man. Not inbreeding, not moral corruption, not ancestral sin. Just the random, meaningless cruelty of biology itself, combined with a society that responded to that cruelty not with compassion, but with exploitation. Not with humanity, but with horror. Not with embrace, but with exile. Joseph Merrick deserved better than the life he got, better than the death he chose, better than the posthumous fame that turned him into a symbol and a spectacle, rather than remembering him as a man who suffered with dignity and died seeking comfort. So the next time you see a sensational title about the Elephant Man, the next time someone tries to sell you a story about dark family secrets and forbidden bloodlines, remember the truth. Joseph Merrick was not the product of sin or inbreeding. He was the victim of random genetic catastrophe and deliberate human cruelty. And his real story is far more terrifying than any Victorian scandal could ever be. Because it reminds us that none of us are safe from the random mutations of biology, and that when those mutations strike, the cruelty of society can be even more monstrous than any physical deformity. That's the cursed truth about Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. A truth that Victorian England tried to bury under rumors of inbreeding, that modern society tries to sanitize with medical terminology and museum exhibits, but that remains what it always was. The story of a gentleman trapped in a nightmare body, abandoned by those who should have protected him, exploited by those who should have helped him, and remembered not for who he was but for what he looked like. Sleep well tonight, knowing that genetic lightning could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time, and that when it does, the real monsters are often the ones who look perfectly normal.